Good morning and welcome back to the Relife podcast. I am your host, Marcus Moore, and today we are going to take a look at an age-old question that has confused more patients, I think, than it's helped. And we're, of course, talking about serotonin theory, or what a lot of you may know as what they call a chemical imbalance. But before we jump into this episode, I'd like to give a huge shout out to the Defining Moments podcast. They're based right here in Oklahoma City. They explore a wide range of the human condition in its totality across a variety of different people through stories and some of the most fantastic interviews I think you're ever going to hear. So if you haven't had a chance to check them out, head over to definingmomentspod.com and see what all the buzz is about. Now, since we've got that out of the way, let's jump into this because it's pretty interesting. I think you're going to enjoy this. Now, back in 1965, there was a professor emeritus at Harvard University by the name of Joseph Schildkraut, and he published a paper that he titled, are you ready? The Catecholamine Hypothesis of Affective Disorders, right? Now, before you freak out, I know that's a mouthful, but rather surprisingly, the title isn't really the most fascinating part about this. His position was that a decrease in catecholamines, specifically norepinephrine, was the cause of depressive disorders. He says, hey, if you have depression, it's because you don't have enough catecholamines. Now, according to the paper, it was nothing more than an imbalance of these catecholamines that caused these periods of depressive episodes. So in simple terms, you have a chemical imbalance, right? That's where the term comes from. Now, as you might imagine, a professor emeritus at Harvard University that publishes a paper outlining the cause of depressive disorders, that's pretty hot stuff, especially in 1965. I mean, this was around the same time that doctors were still smoking cigarettes in the room with patients while they were being diagnosed. So it might be safe to assume that doctors didn't follow the most reasonable logic at the time as we take a look back on history, right? They did what we still do today, and they just followed the majority rule in policy at that time. Now, this paper in and of itself isn't necessarily useless, though. Quite on the contrary, this idea that Schildkraut proposed fueled an international research into neuropsychiatry, which gives us some of the best treatment options for high-risk patients, along with countless peer-reviewed papers both challenging and affirming the hypothesis. So you might be thinking to yourself, why is this an issue? It's a really well-documented study. It's used in thousands of practices across the globe. Why are we even discussing this? Well, hold your horses because this is where it gets pretty interesting. So back in 2022, just a couple years ago, a professor of psychiatry at the University College London named Joanna Moncrieff challenged this idea with her own study. And what she found was pretty striking. What she did is she took a look at all these data sets, okay? It was across 20 different studies that included more than 330,000 people. It's a lot of people. And Joanna discovered that many of these systematic reviews and meta-analyses satisfied less than 50% or half of the criteria necessary to make an accurate case for this supposed chemical imbalance. Now, what's even more shocking is that she found that only around 50% of those results, so only half of them, adequately accounted for interpretation bias. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast or any other podcast really that deals with scientific validity or data sets, you already know that when you conduct an academic study, accounting for bias is super important to arriving at the correct conclusion, right? Now, I'm not going to get really into the specifics of the study. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and link that down below. But keep in mind that while this was a huge flaw in the field of mental health, in a lot of ways, the reality was that this sort of thing was rampant in the 1960s, okay? The amount of change that we've seen in the medical industry over the past 60 years is really incredible if you think about it. So instead of demonizing the study, which anyone can do, what I'd like to do is really talk about the implications of it, right? Let's really get down to the root of what causes you to have the disorder that you're living with right now. So the truth is, we don't know 100% what makes the human brain tick. We've seen some really great ideas. We have some really strong evidence that points towards certain factors, but at the end of the day, no one has an exact answer that fits everybody. And that's really a good thing. That's the beauty of humanity, right? Because in a world that thrives on predictability, we have people that are coming out and purposefully challenging these social and medical norms. And the reality is that when Schildkraut's study was published, this led to more than 60 years of pharmaceutical innovation. We experimented with hundreds of medications and found a way to dive deeper into who we are. And until it was refuted just a couple of years ago, Schildkraut's study opened the door for us to explore neuropsychiatry. This led to a wide variety of behavioral interventions, right? And treatment options like cognitive and dialectic behavioral therapy. This opened the door for us to explore autism spectrum disorder, hyperactivity, and mood disorders in a much more granular kind of scope. So, do you have a chemical imbalance? That's the question. And the answer is that the current body of science says that's just not true. You're much more than the chemicals in your body. And how fantastic is that? How great is it to know that you are much more than just the molecules coursing through your nervous system and veins? What I think is even more fantastic is that the greatest minds in neurology, psychology, and medical science still have no idea what makes disorders happen. They're like, we don't know. We think it's this. We have a lot of studies that show and they point to this, but we don't know what makes everybody tick. And, we have some really strong hunches. We have this big body of evidence, but we just don't know. And I think the best way to answer that question is to have a dialogue around it. And there's no better place to tune into that dialogue than the Defining Moments podcast. Listen, I'm not getting paid to tell you guys about the podcast, okay? Down here in the South, we don't do business like that. If you believe in something, you endorse it. And I'm here to tell you everything they talk about, they live in their daily lives, okay? Give them a chance. You're not going to be disappointed. Listen, you are more than your broken parts, okay? You are more than the sum of your defective parts. You are capable of incredible change. But like we say on every episode, it has to start with you. I can't do it for you. My partner and my friends and the community, none of us can do it for you, even with as much as we would like to. I'm really glad that you're here. I'm glad you're tuning in. Don't let yourself fall into this trap. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today on the Relife podcast. You are more than your molecules, and we'll see you on the next episode.